There was a huge hole in the ground that was maybe a dozen yards deep and several acres large. The dump was on a secluded piece of land on the outskirts of town and probably took up a few hundred acres total. I never got a real grip on how big it was, but it was quite large. We would be directed to a sturdy ramp where they would help us back up to the hole, and there they'd unlatch the rear tailgate for us. Raising the bed of the truck hydraulically from inside the cab allowed our load to slide out of the bed of the truck and into the hole, with us never having to leave our seats. The dump guy would make sure our bed was empty and then signal us to lower the bed back down onto the truck. After he relatched the tailgate, away we would go. As the hole would fill up, the ramp would be moved to a new area, and the already full area would be covered with dirt. This place was always interesting to visit, and they had several large, expensive, and highly specialized machines that did various things around the site, including material separation for recycling, way before it was a thing. We didn't spend any time at the dump, but after you've driven through the place on a regular basis for months, it wasn't hard to start getting familiar with most of what's going on out there. It was a very busy place, actually, and there was a lot of money showing at the dump. Once, over a period of a few months, a growing pack of dogs could be seen there feasting on the fresh garbage. At their peak, there were probably about 20 dogs. We almost always could see them at a distance at some point while we were out there. Even from a distance, you could see that many were missing great swaths of hair, no doubt due to the mange. The whole bunch just looked generally malnourished and sick. After they terrifyingly menaced a dump employee one morning, a couple of officers went out there with automatic rifles and mowed them down, and then just left them right where they landed until they eventually just disintegrated, I guess. You could see a few of them lying out there for weeks until you got bored with it and stopped looking. After the drop-off, we would make the leisurely drive back, stopping somewhere for lunch. While we were gone, our co-workers would hose out and disinfect the execution chamber, preparing it for its next batch. Upon returning and parking the dump truck, we would turn our attention to our uncompleted tasks. The facility there was somewhat old, and probably about 40% of the main building was designed to be open to the elements. During the winter, it had a pretty good heater that worked for you if you were in the inside areas. Our method of cleaning the building and the cells was to use a high-powered water hose. You see, there were no accommodations whatsoever in this short-term facility, so all of the business was just done on the floor of the cells, thus the horrific odor. At times, it was difficult for guests to avoid standing in the urine, vomit, and diarrhea while they stood around waiting to die. The cells had two equal parts, inside and outside. There was a large doorway in the wall that separated the two halves. Our idea of cleaning the cells involved standing in the inside corridor and using a high-powered water hose to blow the filth out of the cells and into an open sewer trench running along the outside of the cells. The concrete sewer trench had a high outside lip that curved back so nothing would blow past it. When we were finished inside, we had to make sure everything in the trench had actually made the trip into the sewer. We could flow a lot of water around there. It didn't take long. The process we employed would result in some of the guests being inadvertently showered with water, as well as other stuff. After completing the task of cleaning, a disinfectant was sprayed onto all the surfaces of the interior. It had a very strong scent of mint, and for a few hours anyway, the place would smell great. When everything was clean, we gave food and water to the guests. Inevitably, the big and mean would just roll right over the small and weak, and some guests starved while others gorged. We could see it happening. It was a crying shame, but there was no sense in reacting. Going without food for a couple of days was not the worst thing that could happen to you around there. Earlier in the day, it would still be dark at the beginning of our shift when the regularly scheduled insanity started 5 days a week. As you walked and crunched along the gravel road on the way to the building, you could hear what sounded and seemed like the sound of panic, and it grew much louder than you thought it would as you got closer. They knew. Unfortunately, most had been there long enough to have a good idea of what went on there. I can't even imagine what it must be like to witness just the normal activities of the place from their perspective, the most extreme, abject fear, live and in person. They all had a number, and names were left at the front gate when they arrived. Meticulous records were kept so we knew who, what, when, where, and sometimes why. But none of that mattered when they passed through that main gate. All that came before was gone, including anything they might have worn in. Because the average stay was measured in days, the only thing our guests could wear was their number. Myself and a co-worker were the lowest men in the organizational hierarchy, so we got to do the worst part of it. We were dressed in black rubber. We had taller than knee-high boots into which we would tuck our pants legs and long, stiff, and heavily textured gloves that came up to our elbows. We also wore long black rubber aprons that went from our chins down to our knees. Looking at us head on, we would be completely covered by black rubber except for our upper arms and our heads. The reason why we were okay with doing what we were doing was because we worked for the government. In the combined wisdom, we were performing an important and necessary job to protect the health and well-being of the citizenry at large. We were paid to do the dirty work with a small salary and a free college education. While in most cases, members of our organization had graduated college first in order to qualify for their position, we were offered a way to work our way up into the organization while at the same time working toward a degree, 100% paid for by the state. The only catch to that was the requirement that you work toward a degree relative to your department. I was going to get a law degree, I imagined. Our daily work would usually average about 4 hours, and we were paid for 8, so we spent the rest of those days doing schoolwork and going to class, and most of the time just hanging out. It was really a great opportunity for a young man in my position. I thought I could handle it. There was often a great deal of drama on display when new arrivals were sometimes dragged screaming, fighting, and pissing, and often bleeding into their assigned cells. But before long, their new reality would set in, and they would, for the most part, go into a kind of wide-eyed, slack-jawed, numb-like shock until something would set them off. As you would move closer to the building in the early morning dew, the smell really kicked in. Even if the wind was blowing it away from you, the odor was still very strong. You actually had to spend a moment mentally fortifying yourself just to tolerate the unbelievable foulness of the air. I don't know why we didn't have masks. As these places go, we were a relatively small operation, so we didn't deal with the types of numbers associated with some of the bigger, more well-known places. We were small enough that there was no way to hide our activities as we carried out our morning's endeavors. They knew that this was the time because it was strictly scheduled, totally predictable, And when we finally opened the door and stepped inside of that place, the already intense noise exponentially increased. My God. As far as they knew, it could be any one of them. But we knew whose turn it was to take the short walk. We were highly organized. As we stepped inside the building, locking and barring the door behind us, there was a long corridor stretched out straight in front of us. The floor was some type of shiny concrete that was very nice, actually. At adequate intervals in the ceiling, centered over and going down the length of the corridor, there were singular overhead light bulbs protected by small steel cages. On each side of the corridor, there were identical cells, one after the other, and the right side of the building looked like a mirror image of the left side, until the very end of the corridor, where it took a 90-degree right turn and disappeared around the corner. We began our duties by walking down the length of the corridor, visually inspecting all the cells, looking for problems we might have to deal with. Then, taking the corridor's right turn at the end, we could take about 5 steps before coming to a rather different kind of door that led into a room-sized, squarely dimensioned concrete box. The floor in this room box was sloped towards a large drain in the center of the floor. In the center of the ceiling, there was a large fan. And when it was off, it was sealed shut, but when it was turned on, you could open the door and it could evacuate the gaseous contents of the box in a matter of seconds. There was no natural or man-made light in the box. Every surface inside was uniformly flat black. If you looked into the large black boxy concrete room closely, you could see that it was very dark in there, and that the wall directly opposite held a set of closed, sealed double doors that together were twice as big as the one we had just opened. There were no handles or hinges to interrupt the smooth surfaces of the walls inside the box, as all the doors could only be opened and were hinged from the outside. I imagine if you had ever happened to be inside the box with the doors closed, it would likely be one of the darkest places you had ever been, in more ways than one. And so the morning's work really begins. Moving back up the corridor toward the entrance of the building, we'd work in pairs, walking along and opening cell gates one at a time as we got to them, so we could move today's departing guests out into the corridor. We would just leave them standing, or in some cases sitting there in the corridor behind us, and continue walking toward the entrance, opening gates and summoning guests out of their cells as we went. By the time we finished and had gotten back to the entrance, the corridor behind us was occupied by 40 to 60 guests who had just been invited out of their cells. There was always a wide variety of departing guests, some silent and some wailing pitifully, and every level of panic in between. Some, you could tell, had likely never had a bad day in their entire life until recently. And you didn't want to look at them too closely because they would inevitably be looking you in the eye, and you didn't want to have to deal with that. If you can imagine this, some were shaking so severely from extreme and absolute fright that they were unable to stand, much less make the required walk. And there were others who thought they might be able to fight their way out of their situation. However, due to their dire situations of late, most had already experienced prolonged malnourishment and at least some level of illness. They had already lost a significant amount of their strength, so subduing them was not that hard. Although always at the risk of being overrun, we carried no firearms. The guys in the mechanic shop made us some very interesting tools to use in our work. They took long, heavy, square-end shovels and rolled the steel into what amounted to a very large fist at the end of a long and sturdy pole. Our goal at this point was to now move these guests down the corridor and then around the corner and into the box. With much noise, most moved grudgingly along. We employed our big steel fists as needed, along with aggressively and continuously shouted commands to encourage guests to keep moving toward the box. After I'd been there a couple of months, I asked if it might be effective to use the high-powered water hoses rather than the steel fists for crowd motivation, and was granted permission to try it out. It worked great and resulted in far fewer injuries. My positive contribution. And we had a very effective method of solving the problem of uncooperative guests, as well as those who were unable to physically make the walk for whatever reason, including the young. In full view of everyone and everything, a couple of us would wrestle them down one at a time, one after the other, trying hard not to get hurt ourselves. We would then inject pure nicotine directly into the heart with a larger than average sized syringe. If necessary, we restrained them with a device we could put around their throat. A few seconds after receiving that shot, and because of several seconds of having their air tightly choked off, they would lose the little bit of fighting ability they might still have possessed. Most would pass out and die within a couple of minutes, though there were others who inexplicably underwent long minutes of dramatically distressing death throes. But the noise eventually faded out because death was guaranteed. We left them to writhe and die on the floor for now. When the guests had all been coerced into the box, we could close and seal the door, which effectively rendered it airtight. This door was actually a Dutch door, so the upper half of the door could open while the lower part of the door remained closed. When the cooperating guests had all entered the box somewhat voluntarily, we would then proceed to carry or drag the previously poisoned guests to the door, opening the top part and then dropping the already dead guests to the floor inside the box, since they were ultimately all going to the same place. There was usually an average of about 2 or 3 adults and a handful of young ones, sometimes more, sometimes less. In fear, we dared not reopen the bottom part of the door once it had been closed, and the upper part would stay open only as long as necessary. One of the benefits of the competence that our government entity was well known for was that we had a predictable and steady flow of guests, so our workload didn't fluctuate much. We never had too much to do, and we certainly never ran out of guests. We were a well-oiled machine at every level. I had heard of the more efficient and easier ways to mass kill, but we were stuck in a budget and people's jobs were at stake, so the status quo was maintained for years, and everyone there was quite comfortable, except for our guests, of course. So once the guests had all been persuaded or dropped into the black box and the door had been closed and sealed, one of us would then trudge back through the building, exit it through the entrance, then around the outside of the building back in the direction of the box. Walking around the end of the exterior of the box revealed the outside of the double doors. On the same outside wall, just beside the doors, there was a contraption that amounted to a gasoline-powered car engine on a stand. This stand held everything required to make the engine run long enough and at a fast enough speed so as to produce an effective amount of carbon monoxide gas suitable for extinguishing dozens of lives as quickly as possible. The box was just about the right size for our usual needs. As long as the guests in the box were standing, there was room for everyone to stand, albeit rather tightly packed most of the time. As the timeline progressed, they all started falling while suffocating to death in the choking pitch black hell. After they started falling, the others would simply stand on them to wage a futile and temporary war to keep from dying, I guess. I think I figured out why sometimes it took 30 minutes and then sometimes it took 3 hours for it to get completely quiet in there. Sometimes it seemed like it just took forever for the quiet to come. I'm thinking it was a weather condition, maybe something like the barometric pressure. And when it would inevitably become quiet, we would kill the engine and for about 5 seconds operate the ceiling fan to partially clear the room. Rather than opening doors and taking the risk of having to deal with the undead, there was a viewing portal in one of the double doors that allowed us to open it up, stick our heads in with a flashlight, and look for movement amid the smoke and near total blackness, and also to listen for signs of life. When it was reasonably confirmed that all was quiet and still in the box, we moved to the next phase. Since the box was now stacked up with dead guests, entangled on top of and under each other, from an operational standpoint, even if the double doors could be mechanically swung inward, they wouldn't be able to move even a fraction of an inch because of the bodies stacked 2 to 6 deep, pushed up against it. So the double doors were swung open outward, revealing a cascade of grotesque, unstacking death. On the outside leading to the double doors was a loading ramp that sloped lower into the ground as the ramp neared the doors. This allowed a truck to back down to the doors of the box, getting progressively lower so that at the lowest point, the floor of the truck bed would be almost against and nearly exactly level with the floor of the box. Before going in, we would run the fan a little longer than necessary to get rid of the balance of the deadly gas. And I also think we needed that moment to get ready mentally and emotionally to dive in there and get busy. Looking into the box from the bed of the truck, you could see a putrid steam rising from the lifeless carcasses. If the smell had been beyond horrible earlier, at this point, there's no way to adequately categorize it. As a result of the dying process, pretty much all of the former guests had released their bowels and their bladders. It was a tangled mess of dead bodies, voluminous urine, perspiration, vomit, blood, and fecal matter. Good God Almighty. Tragically, the littlest ones would always be on the bottom of the pile. In that box, in that miniature and temporary jungle, for a while it was about survival of the fittest. But eventually, even the fittest succumbed to the inevitability of carbon monoxide poisoning. At least the suffering was over, usually. Our task now was to transfer our work product out of the box and into the bed of the truck. Going back in through the main building, we would walk back down the corridor between the cells once again so we could enter the box from the inside of the building, since the backed up truck blocked the outside double doorway. The sides of the truck blocked the view of what we were doing from anyone on the outside, but no one was allowed anywhere near, so we didn't have to worry about that. Stepping through and on cadavers, we made our way across the box to a position near the open double doors leading to the bed of the truck. The truck was harmless looking enough. It was just a 5-ton, 4-wheel drive dump truck with tall sides and a smooth, flat steel bed. The truck's 4-wheel drive suspension caused the truck to sit up high, and in a combination with the sides of the box, the outside, you had been unable to see its contents, except from above. After mentally preparing ourselves, we then went about the task of transferring the cadavers from the box to the truck. Unbelievable experience. Starting at the door, we worked our way into the box, sometimes momentarily standing on the former guests to get leverage. We would lift the guests up one at a time and then rather unceremoniously place them into the bed of the truck. The larger bodies had to be carried by 2 men, but as we progressed deeper into the pile, the smaller ones could be carried by 1 man. And the smallest ones were sometimes just gently pitched into the back of the truck to land on top of the cadaver pile. Sometimes life would persist, so a shot of nicotine was ordered, and after administration, still living guests were then treated as if they had already died, and into the back of the truck they would go. I wouldn't say that the bodies were neatly stacked, but we kept them reasonably straight so we could make it all fit in one trip. We worked as quickly as possible. After emptying the contents of the box into the truck, we would then pull the truck up a few feet and latch the rear gate of the truck bed. 2 of us would then shed our rubber and proceed to the next and least disgusting step. The place where the bodies were disposed of was a few miles away. We would have to drive the truck through the middle of town, looking exactly like normal dump truck driving guys. The general public was blissfully unaware of who we were and what we were actually doing as we passed them on the streets. Many members of the adult public knew what was happening. They didn't have a clue about how we did it, when, or where, but they knew that it was occurring. Had they known exactly, the process probably would have been modified somewhat. But since they had demonstrated that they didn't really care, we just worked to be as efficient time-wise as possible. Once, unknown to us, in the cab of the truck, a very small leg had been caught in the back gate of the bed, and we had gone all the way through town with this leg dangling until it was pointed out to us by a worker at the dump site. Damn. It was sort of small, so maybe no one saw it. I rarely have ever mentioned my early career as a mass murderer for the government. It's not something I'm proud of, but at the time it was generally recognized that it had to be done, and I sure wanted that free education. Before I left, I went through the records and did the math. In my 9 months there, I personally and actively participated in over 6,000 murders. I was following orders in a paramilitary system, and if it hadn't been me, it would have been someone else. So at the time, I justified my personal participation by believing that I would be more humane than whoever else might be there in my place. Relying on my vision at the time of my own basic goodness, I tried to make everyone's experience as pleasant as possible to the extent possible under the circumstances. I've always tried to be a nice guy. Now, over 40 years later, like a lot of people, I guess, my life hasn't really worked out the way I'd hoped. As the sun rises and burns off the early morning fog, I'm sitting here in my car at a highway scenic overlook. All you had to do is look around to realize that you're surrounded on all sides by God's handiwork. It's really quite beautiful here, I say to myself, as fumes from my car's exhaust fills the interior.